72-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo answered his front door at his modest ranch-style home in Citrus Heights, California, on the morning of April 24, 2018, to find a team of Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies and FBI agents standing on his porch with weapons drawn and an arrest warrant charging him with multiple counts of murder. And in that moment, one of the most notorious unsolved serial killer cases in American history was finally closed after more than 4 decades of investigation, countless false leads, and technological breakthroughs that would revolutionize criminal investigations forever. The frail, white-haired grandfather who stood in his doorway, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, bore no resemblance to the sketches that had haunted California for over 40 years. Sketches of a young, athletic man in his 20s who had terrorized communities across the state between 1974 and 1986, committing at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries in an escalating crime spree that began with breaking into homes to steal jewelry and coins, progressed to violent sexual assaults that left victims traumatized for life, and culminated in brutal murders of couples who were bludgeoned to death in their own beds. For decades, law enforcement had hunted the man known variously as the East Area Rapist in Sacramento, the original Night Stalker in Southern California, and eventually the Golden State Killer, a name coined by true crime writer Michelle McNamara, who devoted the final years of her life to investigating the case before dying in 2016, 2 years before the arrest she had fought so hard to see happen. DeAngelo had been a police officer himself during many of his crimes, serving with the Exeter Police Department from 1973 to 1976, and the Auburn Police Department from 1976 to 1979, using his law enforcement training to evade capture, learning police procedures to avoid leaving evidence, and even working cases in areas where he himself had committed crimes just days or weeks earlier. After his final known attack in May 1986, when he bludgeoned and raped 18-year-old Janelle Cruz in her Irvine home before vanishing into the night, DeAngelo simply stopped, retiring into a quiet suburban life as a grandfather, husband, and mechanic at a Save Mart supermarket, living less than 20 miles from many of his Sacramento area victims, attending local events, shopping at grocery stores where his rape victims might also shop, existing as a completely normal member of society while carrying the secret of being one of California's most prolific serial killers. The case went cold. The evidence sat in storage. Victims grew old waiting for justice that seemed would never come. And DeAngelo believed he had gotten away with it all, that the statute of limitations on most of his crimes would protect him, that the passage of time had made him untouchable. But advances in DNA technology, specifically a technique called genetic genealogy, where investigators use commercial DNA databases to identify suspects through their relatives, would prove him catastrophically wrong, leading investigators from a discarded piece of DNA in a decades-old evidence box to a genealogical database, to distant cousins, to a family tree painstakingly reconstructed, and finally to the doorstep of a 72-year-old retiree whose arrest would send shockwaves through law enforcement and give closure to families who had waited more than 40 years to see the monster who destroyed their lives finally held accountable. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, during the final months of World War II. His father, Joseph James DeAngelo Sr., was a United States Air Force sergeant and the family moved frequently during DeAngelo's childhood, as his father was transferred between various military bases across the country and abroad. This constant relocation meant DeAngelo never established deep roots in any community, never maintained long-term friendships, and developed a pattern of isolation and social disconnection that would characterize his entire life. By his teenage years, the family had settled in the Sacramento area of California, where DeAngelo attended Folsom High School and later graduated from Sacramento State University. During his youth, DeAngelo was described by those who knew him as quiet, withdrawn, and somewhat awkward socially. But he was also athletic and intelligent, traits that would later serve him well both in his law enforcement career and in his criminal activities. After graduating from Sacramento State with a degree in criminal justice in 1972, DeAngelo married his first wife, Bonnie Jean Colwell, a psychology student he had met at university. The marriage would last less than 3 years, ending in divorce in 1975 after Bonnie left him for another man, a betrayal that may have been a triggering event in DeAngelo's escalation to violent sexual crimes. In 1973, DeAngelo was hired as a police officer by the Exeter Police Department in Tulare County, California. Exeter was a small town of about 10,000 people located in California's agricultural Central Valley, and the police department employed fewer than a dozen officers. DeAngelo was an unremarkable officer, competent but not exceptional, following procedures but showing no particular initiative or ambition. What his colleagues and superiors did not know was that during his time as an Exeter police officer, DeAngelo was secretly committing a series of burglaries and ransackings in the nearby town of Visalia, just 10 miles from Exeter. The Visalia ransacker, as he would later be known, began his crime spree in April 1974, breaking into more than 120 homes over an 18-month period. These early crimes established DeAngelo's modus operandi that would define his criminal career. He would carefully surveil homes and neighborhoods for days or weeks, learning the schedules of residents, identifying homes where women lived alone or where couples had predictable routines. He would break in during the day when residents were at work or school, moving through the house methodically, ransacking drawers and closets, stealing small items like coins, jewelry, and personal photographs, and often engaging in bizarre behavior like rearranging furniture, taking food from refrigerators, or defecating in the home, acts designed to violate victims' sense of safety and privacy, even beyond the physical theft. The Visalia ransacker's crimes escalated in September 1975, when he was interrupted during a burglary by Claude Snelling, a journalism professor at College of the Sequoias, who caught the intruder attempting to kidnap his 16-year-old daughter Beth from their home. Snelling confronted the masked intruder in his front yard, and the ransacker responded by shooting Snelling twice with a .38 caliber revolver, killing him, then viciously kicking Beth Snelling in the face 3 times before fleeing into the night. This murder, DeAngelo's first, demonstrated his capacity for extreme violence when confronted or challenged, a characteristic that would define his later crimes. In December 1975, police attempted to apprehend the Visalia ransacker during a burglary in progress. A patrol officer spotted a suspicious man near a home that had been targeted and gave chase, but the suspect escaped by jumping over backyard fences and disappearing into the neighborhood. The officer fired 2 warning shots but did not hit the fleeing suspect. Police found a discarded flashlight and decided to stake out the area in case the suspect returned for it. When a man did return hours later, police attempted to arrest him, but he pulled a weapon and fired at the officer, narrowly missing him, before escaping again. This confrontation convinced DeAngelo that Visalia was becoming too dangerous, and the ransacker crimes abruptly stopped in December 1975. By May 1976, DeAngelo had left the Exeter Police Department and moved north to Auburn, California, a foothill town northeast of Sacramento. In July 1976, he was hired as a police officer by the Auburn Police Department, beginning a 3-year tenure during which he would commit some of his most horrific crimes. What DeAngelo's fellow officers didn't know was that their colleague was responsible for the terrifying series of rapes that began plaguing Sacramento neighborhoods just 1 month after he joined the department. The first attack attributed to the East Area Rapist occurred on June 18, 1976, when a man broke into a home in Rancho Cordova, a Sacramento suburb, at 4:00 a.m. and sexually assaulted a woman in her bed. The attack established the pattern that would terrorize the Sacramento area for the next 3 years. The assailant entered through an unlocked window or door that he had surreptitiously unlocked during an earlier reconnaissance visit, surprised victims in their beds, bound them with shoelaces or ligatures he brought with him, and spent hours in the home, assaulting victims repeatedly while eating food from the refrigerator, ransacking belongings, and speaking to victims in a threatening whisper. The attacks were characterized by meticulous planning. The East Area Rapist clearly knew his victims' schedules, their home layouts, and often their personal details, suggesting extensive surveillance before each attack. Over the next 6 months, the East Area Rapist struck at least 15 more times in Sacramento County, always targeting women in single-family homes in middle-class suburban neighborhoods. The attacks followed a disturbing pattern. The rapist would often call victims days or weeks before the assault, breathing heavily into the phone or whispering threats, psychological terrorism designed to increase victims' fear and vulnerability. He would break into homes in the middle of the night, wake victims by shining a flashlight in their faces, and immediately threaten them with weapons, usually a knife or gun, warning them that if they resisted or made noise, he would kill them and anyone else in the house. By early 1977, the East Area Rapist had become front-page news in Sacramento, and the community was gripped by fear. Locksmiths reported being overwhelmed with requests to install additional locks and security systems. Neighborhood watch groups formed, and residents took to patrolling their streets at night. But the attacks continued, and in March 1977, the rapist began calling police directly, taunting them about their inability to catch him. In one recorded call to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, a male voice said, "Gonna kill you, gonna kill you, gonna kill you." These calls demonstrated the rapist's growing confidence and his enjoyment of the fear he was generating. The East Area Rapist's methods became increasingly sophisticated and brazen. He began targeting couples, breaking into homes where married couples or boyfriends and girlfriends lived together. His modus operandi for these attacks was particularly cruel. He would wake the couple with a flashlight and weapon, order the male victim to lie face down on the floor, then stack dishes on the man's back and warn him that if he moved and the dishes rattled, the rapist would kill his female partner. The rapist would then take the woman to another room and assault her repeatedly, sometimes for hours, while her partner lay helpless just feet away, terrified that any movement might result in her murder. This psychological torture was as devastating to victims as the sexual violence itself, destroying relationships and leaving both partners traumatized. By mid-1977, the East Area Rapist had committed more than 30 attacks, and law enforcement from multiple agencies had joined the investigation. But despite the massive resources dedicated to the case, investigators were no closer to identifying the perpetrator. The only physical evidence was the most basic description: a white male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10", tall, athletic build, possibly in his early 20s. Victims who saw his face through his ski mask described him as having an unremarkable appearance. No distinguishing features, scars, or tattoos that would make him easily identifiable. Police sketches varied widely, and the lack of consistent physical description made it nearly impossible to identify suspects. The East Area Rapist attacks continued unabated throughout 1977 and into 1978, expanding beyond Sacramento County into surrounding areas including Contra Costa County, where the attacks took on an even more sinister tone. By October 1977, the rapist had committed more than 40 attacks, and law enforcement had established a task force dedicated solely to his capture. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, working with investigators from neighboring jurisdictions, brought in FBI behavioral analysts to develop a psychological profile of the offender. The profile described the East Area Rapist as a white male in his 20s, possibly with military or law enforcement training given his knowledge of police procedures and surveillance techniques, living in or near the areas where attacks occurred, physically fit and athletic, and likely employed in a job that gave him flexibility to conduct extensive surveillance and attack in the early morning hours. What investigators didn't know was that their profile was remarkably accurate, and that the East Area Rapist was indeed a police officer, Joseph DeAngelo of the Auburn Police Department, who was using his law enforcement knowledge to stay one step ahead of the investigation. DeAngelo had access to police reports about the attacks, knew which neighborhoods were being patrolled more heavily, understood evidence collection procedures and how to avoid leaving traces, and could explain away his odd hours and absence from home by claiming he was working cases or conducting investigations. His position as a police officer gave him the perfect cover for his crimes, allowing him to scout neighborhoods, conduct surveillance, and even interact with potential victims without arousing suspicion. In July 1979, DeAngelo's police career came to an abrupt end when he was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a Pay and Save store in Sacramento. For reasons that remain unclear, DeAngelo, who earned a decent salary as a police officer, chose to steal these items rather than pay for them, and was caught by store security. The Auburn Police Department terminated his employment immediately, and DeAngelo faced misdemeanor theft charges that resulted in probation. The shoplifting incident was bizarre and seemingly out of character for a police officer, leading some investigators to later speculate that DeAngelo was experiencing psychological stress from his double life, or that he was deliberately sabotaging his police career because he planned to escalate his crimes and needed the flexibility of not being a police officer anymore. Whatever his motivation, DeAngelo's firing from the Auburn Police Department in July 1979 coincided with a shift in his criminal pattern. The East Area Rapist attacks in Northern California stopped in July 1979, and for several months, it appeared the crime spree had ended. Victims and investigators alike hoped that perhaps the rapist had been arrested for another crime, had moved away, or had died. But the reality was far more sinister. DeAngelo hadn't stopped attacking people. He had simply moved his operations south and escalated from sexual assault to murder. On December 30th, 1979, in the quiet beach community of Goleta near Santa Barbara, 23-year-old Robert Offerman and 35-year-old Alexandria Manning were found murdered in Offerman's home. Robert was an osteopathic doctor, and Alexandria was a psychologist who worked with adults with developmental disabilities. The couple had been dating for about a year and were spending the night together at Robert's home when an intruder broke in around 3 a.m. The attack was brutal and methodical. The intruder tied up both victims using the same type of ligatures the East Area Rapist had used in Northern California, sexually assaulted Alexandria, then shot both victims multiple times with a .38 caliber handgun as they lay helpless and bound. The crime scene showed signs of ransacking, with drawers pulled out and belongings strewn about, but nothing of significant value was taken. A pattern consistent with the East Area Rapist's behavior. Investigators in Santa Barbara County had never heard of the East Area Rapist. The crimes had occurred 300 miles away in a different part of the state, and in the pre-internet era, information sharing between law enforcement agencies was much more limited. The Offerman Manning murders were investigated as an isolated incident, possibly a burglary gone wrong or a targeted hit by someone who knew the victims. But the killer's methods, the ligatures, the ransacking, and the sexual assault all pointed to the same offender who had terrorized Northern California for years. 3 months later, on March 13, 1980, the killer struck again in Ventura County. Charlene and Lyman Smith, a married couple in their 40s, were brutally murdered in their home in Ventura. Charlene was an interior decorator, and Lyman was a successful attorney. The attack followed the same pattern. The intruder entered their home in the early morning hours, bound both victims, sexually assaulted Charlene, and then bludgeoned both victims to death with a log from their own fireplace. The level of violence was extreme. Both victims suffered massive skull fractures and other injuries, indicating the killer had struck them repeatedly, far beyond what was necessary to cause death. The crime scene was ransacked, personal items were scattered, and small objects were stolen. But again, nothing of significant value was taken. Investigators in Ventura County also had no knowledge of the East Area Rapist or the Goleta murders. They worked their case independently, developing theories about possible motives, perhaps someone who knew Lyman from his legal work, a disgruntled client, or a business associate with a grudge. The idea that these murders were committed by the same person responsible for dozens of rapes in Northern California never entered their investigation, because the information simply hadn't been connected across jurisdictional lines. Over the next 6 years, the killer, now known as the original Night Stalker, a name given by investigative journalist Michelle McNamara to distinguish him from Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker who terrorized Los Angeles in 1985, would commit at least 8 more murders across Southern California. On August 19, 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington, a newly married couple celebrating their first year of marriage, were bludgeoned to death in their home in Dana Point. On February 6, 1981, Manuela Vithun, a 28-year-old nurse, was raped and bludgeoned to death in her home in Irvine while her husband was hospitalized for an illness. On July 27, 1981, Cherie Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were murdered in Goleta. Cherie had been house-sitting for a friend when Gregory came over to spend the evening, and both were bludgeoned to death after being bound and assaulted. Each murder followed a similar pattern. The killer entered through unlocked doors or windows, attacked victims in the early morning hours between 2 and 5 a.m., bound victims with ligatures or rope, sexually assaulted female victims, ransacked the home taking small items but nothing valuable, and killed victims through blunt force trauma or shooting. The attacks showed meticulous planning. The killer clearly knew when victims would be home, their schedules, whether they lived alone or with partners. In several cases, the killer cut phone lines before entering to prevent victims from calling for help, demonstrating premeditation and tactical thinking. But because these murders occurred across multiple jurisdictions, Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, Orange County, and because each jurisdiction worked its cases independently without knowledge of the others, the pattern went unrecognized for years. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, when DNA technology became available and cold case investigators began reviewing unsolved murders and sexual assaults, that connections began to emerge suggesting all these crimes might be the work of the same offender. DeAngelo's final known attack occurred on May 4th, 1986, in Irvine, Orange County. Janelle Cruz was an 18-year-old high school senior, a popular student who was looking forward to graduating and attending college. She was home alone that night. Her parents and siblings were out of town, when the killer broke into her home through an unlocked sliding glass door. Janelle was raped and bludgeoned to death with a pipe wrench from her own garage, her skull fractured in multiple places from the ferocity of the attack. Her body was discovered the next day by her family, who had returned home to find their daughter murdered in her own bed. The Janelle Cruz murder was particularly heartbreaking because of how close she had been to beginning her adult life, and how preventable her death should have been if law enforcement had connected the cases earlier and warned communities that a serial killer was operating across Southern California. After Janelle's murder, the original Night Stalker attacks abruptly stopped. No similar crimes were reported in California or elsewhere, leading investigators to speculate that the killer had either died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply stopped killing. The reality was that Joseph DeAngelo, now 40 years old, had decided to retire from his criminal career and live out the rest of his life as a normal member of society. After May 1986, Joseph DeAngelo vanished into suburban anonymity, living a seemingly ordinary life while carrying the secret of being one of California's most prolific serial killers and rapists. He had married his second wife, Sharon Huddle, in 1973, and together they raised 3 daughters in Auburn and later Citrus Heights, just miles from many of his Sacramento area crime scenes. DeAngelo worked as a mechanic at a Save Mart supermarket distribution center, showing up for work regularly, maintaining cordial if distant relationships with co-workers, and living in a modest ranch-style home in a quiet middle-class neighborhood. Neighbors described him as odd and antisocial. He rarely engaged in conversation. His yard was unkempt and filled with boats and old vehicles, and he was known for occasionally yelling at neighbors over minor disputes, but nothing about his behavior suggested he was capable of murder. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, DeAngelo lived this double existence. Publicly, he was a grandfather attending his grandchildren's sporting events and family gatherings. Privately, he carried the knowledge of 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries that remained officially unsolved. As DNA technology advanced and cold case units across California began re-examining old evidence using new forensic techniques, DeAngelo's crimes began to be connected in ways that had been impossible when they originally occurred. The breakthrough in connecting the cases came in 2001, when DNA testing of evidence from the East Area Rapist crimes in Northern California was matched to DNA from the original Night Stalker murders in Southern California. Crime lab analysts compared DNA from rape kits and murder scenes and discovered that the same male DNA profile appeared in cases spanning from Sacramento to Orange County from 1976 to 1986. This revelation was stunning. What investigators had believed were multiple unrelated series of crimes committed by different offenders was actually the work of a single serial offender who had operated across hundreds of miles and multiple decades. The matching DNA meant that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. A criminal who had escalated from burglary to rape to murder over the course of his decade-long crime spree. This discovery led to the formation of new task forces and the reopening of dozens of cold cases. Law enforcement agencies across California began sharing information, comparing notes, and building a comprehensive database of all crimes potentially linked to this unknown offender. Despite having the killer's DNA profile, investigators still could not identify him. They ran the DNA through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system that contains DNA profiles of convicted offenders, but there was no match. This meant that whoever committed these crimes had never been arrested for a felony requiring DNA collection, or had committed their crimes before DNA databases existed and had never been required to submit a sample. Investigators pursued thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of suspects, collected DNA from persons of interest, but year after year the case remained cold. In 2013, true crime writer Michelle McNamara became fascinated with the case and began her own investigation, collaborating with retired detectives and cold case investigators to compile information and develop new theories about the killer's identity. McNamara coined the term Golden State Killer to refer to the offender, believing that a unifying name would help generate public interest and keep attention focused on solving the case. She wrote extensively about the crimes on her blog, True Crime Diary, and eventually signed a book deal to write a comprehensive account of the case and the investigation. McNamara's work brought renewed attention to the Golden State Killer, introducing the case to a new generation and inspiring amateur sleuths and online communities to investigate. She worked closely with investigators, sharing information and developing theories, and she became personally invested in seeing the case solved. Tragically, McNamara died unexpectedly in her sleep in April 2016 at age 46, 2 years before the arrest she had worked so hard to help bring about. Her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published posthumously in 2018, just months after Joseph DeAngelo's arrest, and became a bestseller, cementing her legacy as a key figure in keeping the case alive and pushing for its resolution. The breakthrough that finally identified Joseph DeAngelo came not from traditional detective work or a CODIS match, but from an emerging technology called investigative genetic genealogy. In early 2018, investigators working on the Golden State Killer case partnered with a genetic genealogy company to upload the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a free public database where people upload their DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. Unlike commercial DNA testing companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com that require consent to share data with law enforcement, GEDmatch was specifically designed for people to share their DNA publicly to find distant relatives. When investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch in March 2018, the database identified several distant cousins, people who shared enough DNA with the killer to indicate they were related, but not closely enough to be immediate family. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, working with FBI analyst Steve Kramer and Sacramento District Attorney investigator Paul Holes, began the painstaking process of building family trees for each of these distant cousins, tracing their ancestry back several generations to find common ancestors who might be the killer's great-great-grandparents. This process took hundreds of hours of research, combing through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and other public records to trace multiple family lines and identify all possible descendants. The team eventually identified a common ancestral couple who had lived in the 1800s, and from there built out a family tree of all their descendants, eventually narrowing the list to men of the right age who had lived in Northern California during the 1970s and 1980s. One name on that list was Joseph James DeAngelo, born in 1945, who had lived in the Sacramento area during the time of the East Area Rapist attacks. When investigators ran a background check on DeAngelo, they discovered he had been a police officer in Auburn from 1976 to 1979, exactly coinciding with many of the attacks, and that he had been fired for shoplifting in 1979, right when the attacks in Northern California stopped. This was too much coincidence to ignore. Investigators put DeAngelo under surveillance, following him for several days and waiting for an opportunity to collect his DNA to confirm the match. On April 19, 2018, surveillance officers observed DeAngelo leaving his home and discarding a tissue in a public trash can. They retrieved the tissue and sent it to the crime lab for testing. 3 days later, on April 23rd, they observed DeAngelo leaving his car at a hobby store parking lot, and they swabbed the driver's side door handle, collecting additional DNA samples. The DNA from both the tissue and the door handle was tested and compared to the Golden State Killer's DNA profile from the crime scenes. The results came back as a match. Joseph James DeAngelo's DNA matched DNA from multiple murder and rape scenes across California, spanning a decade. After more than 40 years, investigators had finally identified the Golden State Killer. On the morning of April 24, 2018, a team of Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies, FBI agents, and investigators from multiple agencies converged on DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights. They knocked on the door, and when DeAngelo answered wearing a bathrobe, they announced they had a warrant for his arrest for murder. DeAngelo, now 72 years old, frail and appearing confused, was handcuffed and taken into custody without resistance. Inside his home, investigators found evidence of his crimes: photos, maps, newspaper clippings about the cases, items he had kept as trophies for over 4 decades. The arrest made international headlines. Law enforcement held a press conference announcing they had solved one of California's most notorious cold cases, explaining how genetic genealogy had led them to DeAngelo. Victims who had waited decades for justice wept with relief. Families of murder victims who had long ago given up hope that their loved ones' killers would be caught suddenly had answers. And the revolutionary use of genetic genealogy to solve the case opened up new possibilities for solving other cold cases, leading to dozens of additional arrests in cases that had been unsolved for decades. Joseph DeAngelo's first court appearance came on April 27, 2018, just 3 days after his arrest. He was wheeled into the Sacramento County Superior Court in a wheelchair, wearing orange jail clothing, his white hair disheveled, looking frail and elderly, a stark contrast to the young, athletic man described in witness reports from the 1970s and 1980s. DeAngelo did not speak during the hearing, except to acknowledge he understood the charges. 2 counts of murder with special circumstances, with additional charges expected as prosecutors from 6 different California counties coordinated their cases. The investigation into DeAngelo revealed a man who had successfully hidden his monstrous crimes for over 3 decades while living what appeared to be a normal life. His ex-wife, Sharon Huddle, from whom he was separated but not divorced, released a statement through her attorney expressing shock and devastation at the allegations, stating she had no knowledge of his crimes and had lived with him for decades without suspecting anything. His 3 daughters, now adults, were reportedly horrified and struggled to reconcile the grandfather they knew with the monster described in the charges. Neighbors and co-workers interviewed by media expressed similar disbelief. DeAngelo had worked at the Save Mart distribution center for 27 years, retiring in 2017. And while co-workers described him as odd and sometimes angry, no one had suspected he was capable of such violence. Neighbors recalled him as an angry, strange man who kept to himself and occasionally had verbal altercations over property disputes. But again, nothing that would suggest he was the Golden State Killer. As prosecutors built their case, they faced significant legal challenges. Many of DeAngelo's crimes had occurred so long ago that statutes of limitations barred prosecution for most of the rapes and burglaries. However, there is no statute of limitations on murder in California. So prosecutors focused on charging DeAngelo with 13 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, murders committed during the commission of rape and burglary, which made him eligible for the death penalty. Between 2018 and 2020, DeAngelo sat in Sacramento County Jail awaiting trial. Prosecutors from Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange, and Tulare counties coordinated the most complex capital murder case in California history, involving crimes spanning 12 years and hundreds of miles. The evidence against DeAngelo was overwhelming. His DNA matched crime scenes from across the state. Surveillance records and phone records placed him near crime scenes on the dates of attacks, and witness descriptions from victims who had survived attacks matched his physical appearance from the 1970s and 1980s. In April 2019, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty against DeAngelo, describing him as a poster child for capital punishment, given the number and brutality of his crimes. But by June 2020, facing the prospect of a trial that could last years and cost tens of millions of dollars, and considering the trauma of forcing elderly victims to testify and relive their assaults, prosecutors agreed to a plea deal. DeAngelo would plead guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping to commit robbery, and would admit to dozens of additional uncharged rapes and burglaries. In exchange, the death penalty would be taken off the table, and DeAngelo would receive multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. On June 29, 2020, Joseph DeAngelo appeared in a makeshift courtroom set up in a Sacramento State University ballroom to accommodate social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the course of several hours, prosecutors read out a detailed recitation of his crimes, each rape, each burglary, each murder, and DeAngelo, in a weak, barely audible voice, pleaded guilty to each count. The hearing was attended by over 150 people, including victims, family members of victims, law enforcement officers, and media, all gathered to witness the man who had terrorized California finally admit his guilt. The formal sentencing hearing took place over 4 days in August 2020, and it became a cathartic moment for the dozens of victims and family members who had waited decades for this day. Judge Michael Bowman presided over the proceedings, which included victim impact statements from survivors of DeAngelo's attacks and family members of his murder victims. These statements were powerful, heartbreaking, and at times angry, as people who had been terrorized by DeAngelo decades earlier finally had the chance to confront him. One by one, victims took the stand. Women now in their 60s and 70s, who had been raped by DeAngelo in their 20s, sisters and children of murder victims who had grown up without their loved ones, husbands who had been forced to listen to their wives being assaulted while lying helpless on the floor. Each told their story, the terror of waking to find a masked man with a gun standing over them, the trauma of being bound and assaulted for hours, the decades of nightmares and hypervigilance, the relationships destroyed by PTSD, the normal lives stolen by his actions. Gay and Bob Hardwick, whose daughter Keith Harrington was murdered along with her husband Patrice in 1980, described 4 decades of grief and unanswered questions. Ron Harrington, whose brother Keith was killed, told the court he had dedicated his life to finding his brother's killer, and seeing DeAngelo finally held accountable was the culmination of 40 years of advocacy. Jennifer Carroll, daughter of murder victims Lyman and Charlene Smith, described growing up without parents, being raised by relatives, and always wondering who had taken her mother and father from her. Survivors of sexual assaults spoke about how DeAngelo's attacks had affected every aspect of their lives, their marriages, their mental health, their ability to feel safe in their own homes. Some women spoke about divorcing their husbands because the trauma of the attack had destroyed their relationships. Others described decades of therapy, medication for anxiety and depression, and the constant fear that the East Area Rapist would return. Many expressed relief that he had finally been caught, but also anger that it had taken so long, that they had lived most of their lives without justice. Throughout these 4 days of testimony, Joseph DeAngelo sat slumped in his wheelchair, wearing a face mask, showing no visible emotion. He stared straight ahead, occasionally closing his eyes, but never looking at the victims who were describing the lifelong impact of his crimes. His apparent frailty and advanced age stood in stark contrast to the vibrant, traumatized survivors who confronted him, highlighting the profound injustice of how he had lived a normal life while his victims suffered for decades. On August 21, 2020, after all victim impact statements had been heard, Judge Bowman gave DeAngelo one final opportunity to address the court before sentencing. In a shocking moment, DeAngelo, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, stood up from his wheelchair, removed his face mask, and spoke. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them," he said in a weak, shaky voice, "and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." It was the first time DeAngelo had acknowledged his victims directly, though the apology rang hollow, given the magnitude of his crimes and the decades he had remained silent while his victims suffered without answers. Judge Bowman then delivered the sentence: 11 consecutive life terms, without possibility of parole for the murders, plus additional consecutive life terms for the kidnappings and weapon enhancements, ensuring that even if some convictions were overturned on appeal, DeAngelo would still die in prison. Judge Bowman addressed DeAngelo directly, saying, "When a person commits monstrous acts, they must be contained so they can never harm another innocent person. And that's the reason for the sentence I'm imposing on you." Joseph DeAngelo was immediately transported from the courtroom to state prison. He was first housed at North Kern State Prison, and as of 2025, he is incarcerated at California State Prison, Corcoran, in protective custody due to his status as a former police officer and serial killer, both of which make him a target for violence from other inmates. At age 79, DeAngelo will spend the rest of his life in a small cell, isolated from the general prison population, with no possibility of ever being released. He will die in prison, his legacy being that of one of California's most notorious serial killers, a man who terrorized an entire state for over a decade before being brought to justice 4 decades later through revolutionary DNA technology. The Golden State Killer case fundamentally changed criminal investigations in America and around the world. The use of genetic genealogy to identify DeAngelo demonstrated that even decades-old cold cases could be solved using DNA evidence combined with public genealogy databases. Since DeAngelo's arrest in 2018, genetic genealogy has been used to solve over 200 other cold cases, including murders, rapes, and unidentified remains that had remained unsolved for 30, 40, or even 50 years. The technique has given closure to countless families and demonstrated that even the coldest cases can be solved with persistence and new technology. The case also sparked important debates about privacy, DNA databases, and law enforcement access to genetic information. While most people supported using genetic genealogy to catch violent criminals like DeAngelo, civil liberties advocates raised concerns about the implications of law enforcement having access to databases containing DNA information from millions of people who uploaded their data to find relatives, not to be part of criminal investigations. These debates continue, with some genealogy companies restricting law enforcement access and others establishing policies governing how their databases can be used for investigative purposes. For the victims of the Golden State Killer, DeAngelo's arrest and conviction provided long-awaited answers and a measure of justice, though it could never undo the trauma they had endured or bring back the loved ones they had lost. Many victims who had spent 40 years looking over their shoulders, changing their names, moving to new cities, and living in fear of the day the East Area Rapist might return to finish what he started, finally found some peace knowing he would never hurt anyone again. The case stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators who never gave up, even when the trail went cold for decades. Detectives like Paul Holes, who spent 24 years of his career working on the Golden State Killer case before finally seeing it solved shortly before his retirement, demonstrated the importance of cold case investigations and never giving up on victims. Michelle McNamara, whose tireless advocacy and writing brought renewed attention to the case, showed how civilian involvement and true crime journalism can keep old cases alive and push for justice. Joseph DeAngelo, the former police officer who used his training to become one of America's most prolific serial killers, is now an elderly man spending his final years in a prison cell, his crimes finally exposed, his victims finally vindicated, and his case serving as proof that justice, even when delayed by decades, can still be achieved. The Golden State Killer terrorized California for over a decade and evaded capture for 40 years. But in the end, science, persistence, and the courage of survivors brought him to justice, ensuring that the cold case that took 40 years to solve was finally definitively closed.